Have you ever wondered how to pair the aspects together in multiplayer in Marvel Champions? If so, this could be the video for you. We're looking at 2, 3, and 4 player. If you're a solo player, this video might not be so helpful, but hopefully it's interesting. And hey, maybe this is a good time to try two-handed play, which is one person playing two heroes at once. A bit more complicated than playing one hero, obviously, but very, very fun. It's something I enjoy quite a lot. And we'll start with 2-player, but everything in 2-player kind of carries forward up to 4-player. The more players you add, it's just more people to consider, but the same principles are there. And the first thing to know about multiplayer, of course, is that everyone can kind of specialize a bit more. But the second thing to know is that not all aspects pair equally. They each have different strengths, and that can affect what you'll want to choose. For example, aggression is really good at dealing damage, typically, controlling minions and so on. And, dealing damage is one of the primary forms of output in the game. Very good to have that on your team. Again, then we have justice, really good at removing threat. Threat removal is the other main form of output in the game, keeps the threat down, stops the loss condition, while aggression can push toward the win condition, making these a really good pairing. But it goes a bit deeper than that. If Marvel Champions was a video game, maybe you would be able to look back at your stats afterwards and see how much damage each player had done, how much threat removal each player had done. And if you could do that, I think with this pairing, we might see something a little bit like this. And it is just a rough estimate, and very rough estimate, and it will vary depending on your deck, characters, the scenario, so on and so forth. But you'll see aggression doing the majority of damage, just as doing the majority of threat removal. Then we have the final pillar of the game, which is incoming damage, and I would say that would generally be split roughly 50-50. Aggression will take care of itself, just as that player will take care of themselves, and they will hopefully be just fine. And this is interesting to look at because I don't think all aspects pair together so neatly like this. Some might have gaps where things don't work out. This is especially true at 2 and 3 player because not every aspect can be brought along. So we can look at all their strengths here, and this is a very simplified version. The previous video I did understanding the aspects goes much deeper into detail, but generally we could say these are the biggest strengths of each aspect. Aggression deals damage, justice removes threat, protection is very much known for damage mitigation, and leadership can kind of do a bit of everything. It can do it quite well, quite flexibly. It kind of, supports where it needs to a lot in multiplayer. Now, there are exceptions. There are exceptions to everything. This video is very much kind of a starting point and an overview. So protection, for example, it has a lot of builds which actually make it more of an all-rounder, which should make it more similar to leadership. But the majority of builds and what it's known for will be mitigating damage, keeping people alive against the attacks and so on and so forth. So that's what we're looking at here. And I know what you're thinking, VillainTheory, you said it's good to have different strengths. They all have different strengths. Surely they all go well together. Well, yes and no. If you are good at deck building, if you have a good understanding of the heroes, if you have a big card collection, you can really make anything work together. And even if you don't have, all the cards and so on and all the expertise, you will still have success in different ways with different combinations. But some things fit together more naturally than others. So I don't like aggression pairing with protection, for example. Why is that? Well, here's what I think happens. Aggression will do the majority of damage, which is fine. Protection will cover the majority of, incoming attacks and things. Absolutely fine. But I think they struggle with threat removal. Now, aggression and protection, with the right builds and cards, can actually have pretty solid threat removal, but threat scales up quite a lot in multiplayer, and you generally have to go out of your way to find it in solo builds with these. If I was to look at the threat removal possibilities with aggression and protection, it is significantly below where justice and leadership would have their threat removal. So one of the big dangers with these two pairing together is you won't be able to handle all the threats. Now, there are some mitigating factors here. If protection is stopping you taking even more damage, you won't need to go Ultra Ego, which will mean less threat goes on the main scheme. But generally, I think these are quite an unnatural pairing. They can work absolutely fine, but you will have to work hard for it. And why is this? Well, we can look at things in a different way. We can look at not the strengths, but the weaknesses. Yes, you want different strengths, but you don't want the same weaknesses, and that's kind of what happens with aggression and protection. And I know people will have questions about what's on here. I know people think, oh, justice can do loads of damage. Oh, protection can as well with the right builds. With the right builds, they can definitely do quite a lot. I would say it's still significantly below aggression and leadership for the most part. Repurpose protection, probably a big exception, but nonetheless, it is generally true in my opinion, especially outside of solo play, where the amount of damage you need to do scales up quite a lot, and Justice's best damage card, which would probably turn the tide, doesn't work quite as reliably there, so on and so forth. So I do think Justice and Protection lack for a bit of damage, and I do think threat removal is both aggression and protection's weakness there. So unfortunately, protection is kind of coming in with two weaknesses here, and this might confuse people, as you might be thinking, well, if protection's strength is damage mitigation, why does no one have a weakness of damage mitigation? And that is because every aspect in the game, however they want to build, they will always have access to cheap allies or allies that are maybe more expensive but good at blocking, as well as status cards. If I'm an aggression, I can take plenty of 2-cost allies, very easy to drop them onto the board, maybe get some damage out of them, and then block with them, keep going with the rest of my game plan with the rest of my resources in hand. So nobody really has bad damage mitigation. Some decks have bad damage mitigation, but that is because they chose not to put in allies and status cards and so on and so forth. They chose to maybe go a bit more event heavy, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it is a gap in the deck itself and not with what the aspect is capable of. If you only have the core set, you will have less allies than most players will. It will be a bit trickier, but in general, every aspect has access to tons and tons of allies, and these days more status cards than ever. So it's a little bit unfortunate, but that's just kind of the way of it, that the one thing protection is really good at, everyone else can kind of cover somewhat decently, which means protection ends up with one extra weakness because, anyone can kind of cover what it's really good at covering. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, leadership, I don't think has any weaknesses. We talked about this in the understanding the aspects video, but generally, because it's a jack of all trades, it kind of covers all of its bases. So we can look at it through the lens of not just pairing up the strengths, but making sure the weaknesses are covered as well. And that is why aggression and justice go so well together and how they pair up. We can then look at this in protection and kind of what I just talked about, see why it doesn't match up so well. Aggression and protection share that weakness, so it can be harder to counter for that in deck building and gameplay. But then what does protection go with? Well, protection goes really well with leadership. So protection will cover leadership and help protect it, but leadership can then, because it doesn't have to worry about defending itself, it can put all its flexibility, all its versatility into threat removal and dealing damage, which will cover everything for protection. So in multiplayer, in 2-player, you could look back at a game and see maybe something that looks a little bit like this. So this is, again, a very, very rough estimate. It will vary so much based on the decks. I mean, leadership decks probably vary more than anything, and it will depend on the heroes. Aspects are just part of the total package. I cannot emphasize that enough. In general, leadership and protection make an excellent team. So overall, we could look at a chart like this, and that will cover basically everything I've been trying to say here. Aggression goes really well with justice or leadership. Justice goes well with aggression or leadership. Leadership kind of being able to do anything, very versatile, kind of pairs with anything very well, even itself. Double leadership is very powerful. Protection, unfortunately, I would say only has a really solid pairing with leadership, but again, with the right characters, heroes, deck building, cards in your collection, that kind of thing, protection and anything can pair together really, really well. So think of this as a starting point, not the only thing you can do. For example, I kind of mentioned it earlier, protection can kind of be an all-rounder. If your character has, pretty decent stats all around, and you put a lot of readying to keep using those stats repeatedly into the deck, well, protection is less about damage mitigation maybe in that case, and that deck might be more of an all-rounder. Leadership, particularly with perhaps the X-Force sort of team trait builds that have come up more recently, can be absolutely devastating at threat removal, even at large player counts. So leadership can kind of fill in for maybe what justice does and so on. So while I've paired them up based on aspect here, and we will mainly stick to this throughout the video, you could look at things a little bit differently, like this, with damage pairing well with thwarting characters. But damage could be, it could be leadership. It could even be an aggressive readying protection build on a character with high attack stat. Thwarting, again, it could be a very high threat removal character, high thwarting stat. In protection, it could be leadership. You can mix all these things up. So you can kind of think about things like this, but this is slightly outside the scope of this video, but just be aware of all the possibilities that you can explore in this game. It's really fun. It's why I'm still playing today. There's just so much you can do with it. But like I said, we'll stick mostly with the normal aspects for the purpose of this video, but remember, it's an overview. So these are the basic 2-player combinations. But there is one aspect we haven't talked about that we need to, and that is the Paul aspect. So one of its strengths is dealing damage. Maybe not as good as aggression, but it's definitely a strength. It's also not very good at threat removal. And overall, this kind of means Paul is equal to aggression in most team building scenarios. So if you are trying to play a Paul deck, treat it like aggression and pair it, in my opinion, with justice or leadership for the best results. Now, there is a caveat here that one of its other strengths is what I call amplifying your hero. So if you're a hero that's very, very good at threat removal and you play in the Paul aspect, your actual overall deck might be a bit more like leadership. So there are exceptions. It can be an all-rounder. Paul is a strange aspect. But overall, I would compare it to aggression. That is the safest comparison for the most consistent results. But back to the video, we're going to move on, except we haven't looked at every combination. We've looked at the traditional combinations, 2 people playing different aspects. What if you play the same aspect? Can that even work? I say yes. And I think every aspect can work together very well in 2-player. kind of on the grounds that you can kind of bring two solo decks that do a bit of everything together, and then, both of you can just do a little bit of everything, cover for each other, and that works pretty well. So two Justice decks, for example, would have lots and lots of threat removal. You would need to build in a bit more damage than usual, but that would work just fine, and you'd have pretty good results. The aspects which I think work best together are aggression, leadership, and pool. And aggression with aggression is typically going to be a rush strategy game. Just go all in on the damage and try and win before threat removal or taking too much damage becomes too big of a problem to handle. Leadership at leadership is kind of cheating because leadership is already kind of the all-rounder kind of aspect, but leadership does pair together, I think, especially nicely. You can put upgrades on each other as allies depending on which ones are better. For that specific upgrade, you can make the call. You can play with different allies in more interesting ways. They have a lot of interaction, which I think is really fun. And then we've got the pool aspect, which a little bit like aggression is probably going to try and win before things become too much of a problem, but in a bit of a different way. The pool aspect likes negative icons like crisis icons, acceleration icons, and it can put them out onto the board. Normally in multiplayer, pool will put out some bad icon. Now everyone kind of has to suffer because of the pool player. It's a little bit awkward sometimes, but in multiplayer, if you have multiple people playing the pool aspect, and if you only have one card collection, this is a bit tougher, but if you each own a copy of Deadpool, you can both play in the pool aspect, and now two people can benefit from one negative icon, which works very nicely. So let's start to look at 3-player and 4-player and take these lessons forward. So in 2-player, we saw the problem with aggression and protection, but in 3 and 4-player, these pair together really well. You just need to add in one of the other aspects. Now we have a very, very nice divide between aggression focusing on damage, justice focusing on threat removal, protection focusing on damage mitigated, and those are really the bones of the game. And if you have all of those covered, it's very difficult to lose. You might need people to help remove attachments, that kind of thing. Some scenarios are won more through threat removal than damage, but by and large, this will work really, really well. And I would say if you had to cut one of the aspects, I would not cut justice. Again, this is a really broad look at things, a very much an overview and starting point, but justice is very powerful. And why is that? Well, in lower player counts, leadership can easily keep up with justice's threat removal, in my opinion. Justice probably does it still a little bit better, but leadership can do it more than well enough. It can do it very, very well. However, in multiplayer, Justice has some extra tools to play with here. It's got cards like Even the Odds and Spider-Man Peter Parker and new card Team Investigation, which scale their threat removal per player. So the more players in the game, the better the threat removal on these cards are. And these cards become really very, very powerful when you get into 3 and 4 player. Even the Odds is, honestly, with player side schemes now existing, the way it removes 1 threat from each side scheme per player, you can pay 2 costs for this card, 3 effective resources, and if there are like 3 or 4 side schemes out, you're taking like 12 to 16 threat off with this 2-cost card. It is kind of unmatched. The only thing that starts to come close is Overwatch, which came out during the Sinister Motives wave. Actually, so did Even the Odds. That was a very good wave for Justice. You find these both, I believe, in Spider-Ham's pack. Overwatch is just very, very strong because it basically duplicates the threat removal you do from one scheme to another scheme. There are more schemes in multiplayer. You can do bigger amounts of threat removal because there are generally more threat on those schemes. It's just very, very efficient, while leadership and the other aspects don't really have anything that scales in the same way, at least at the time I record this. Now, having one of each aspect is by far the most common strategy in multiplayer, especially if, 4-player where you can have all of them, but even 3-player, normally it's one of each and then, one just sits out. But you can take multiple of one aspect in multiplayer, and there are a lot more possibilities for this than 2-player, in my opinion. I think it works a lot better. It's a lot more interesting because you have lots more combos between the players going on. So my general rules for this would be a maximum of 2 Justice players. Now, you could do more. You can actually do 4 of any aspect, and it can work out with the right deck building, characters, and gameplay. But you have a smoother time, with a bit of moderation. But there's so much threat in 4-player that 2 Justice characters will do fine. And there are player side schemes now as of next evolution, so you can really lean into those with multiple Justice players as well on the team and get a lot of nice results. Multiple aggression heroes work very well as well, kind of as we looked at in 2-player. If you have a lot of aggression characters, you're going to want to win fast and kind of go for more of a rush strategy, or at least a high tempo strategy, but that can work very well as long as everyone is on board with that game plan. Any number of leadership heroes works because they are the all-rounder, jack of all trades, very versatile. Everyone can help everyone, and a lot of ally cards can kind of interact with other people's ally cards, which is a very, very nice kind of way to get easy synergy. A common way to do this would be to say have one player play Avengers leadership, one player play Guardians leadership, one player play X-Men leadership. That's also very fun. You could have maybe Cyclops, Star-Lord, Captain America, kind of the respective leaders of each group. Very, very fun, works extremely well. And because leadership is so good at threat removal in general, that is one way you can easily skip out on having a Justice player and not really feel the effects too heavily. The one aspect I'm not so keen on having multiple of is protection. And there are examples if someone's running a repurposed deck, a readying deck, a kind of all-rounder deck, or maybe even a leading blows kind of attack-oriented deck. There are exceptions where protection can easily have multiple characters in the game, but I would not run multiple defensive, real protecty protection decks in one game because it's just a little bit too passive. One of the advantages of Justice and Aggression is that they're quite proactive aspects at going and dealing with problems, whereas Protection, it will slow down the damage you take, but it won't really deal with things on the board like side schemes and minions or anything, so you can kind of get overwhelmed. So Protecty Protection, more than one of those, a little bit too slow for me, a little bit too passive in my opinion, but otherwise you can be quite creative. And we can see that here in Free Player. These are some examples. Any of the aspects kind of really pair well together. I would definitely prioritize Justice, but again, you can have something like Aggression, Leadership, and Protection, and it will do just fine. And one of my favorites is actually double Aggression and Leadership. This is not a rush deck per se, but generally you have the Aggression players plowing forwards, laying into the villain, with the Justice player desperately trying to keep the game afloat, which is kind of a nice balance. It's probably, in my opinion, a little bit more reliable than Rush. It has some downsides, but it also has some upsides. You can be a bit more flexible, maybe spend a turn or two setting up for some really fast damage after that, almost like the Aggression players are going for maybe a slightly delayed Rush. 1 or 2 turns of setup, and then just go all out. Really fun, really enjoy that. And of course, Leadership can just combo in on itself, but you could also have 2 Leadership decks kind of with any other aspect as well. Works very nicely at 3 player. Moving on to 4 player, there are way too many possibilities for me to list, but these are some of my favorite. Obviously, the classic one of each aspect works really nicely, and of course you can substitute Aggression for Pull in any of these examples we've looked at any player count, but generally, one of each, really, really solid. Double Aggression, Double Justice kind of works for the reasons we've talked about. There's lots of damage. You cannot have too much damage. This is why Aggression works with multiple. If you've got too much damage, the villain is defeated and you've won. So Double Aggression will make for quite fast games, with Double Justice making the threat pretty safe. People can go Ultrigo very easily, so actually works completely fine. I really like that. Aggression and Double Justice, again, lean more into player side schemes. Maybe the Aggression and Protection player are bringing some player side schemes as well. Very, very nice. And of course, you can have double leadership with, Justice and Protection. Works very well. Double leadership basically works with everything. But again, if you own the scaling cards or the player playing Justice owns the scaling cards, I do recommend trying to keep one of them in the modern game because it just works so very well, especially if you use player side schemes. But double leadership works very, very well with Justice and Protection. It could be Aggression and Justice as well as double leadership. It's really very flexible. Hopefully that makes sense. Lots and lots of possibilities you can explore. And even if you just stick to the classic, one of each aspect, hopefully breaking down the roles in the way I have in this video has been useful to see quite why they work so well together. And that about does it for this video. However, next video is going to be very interesting. I'm very excited for it. In the next video, I'm looking at every single hero and ranking how well they do in every single aspect at every single player count. It's going to be a pretty big undertaking, but I'm pretty confident on it. I've done most of the work already, and it's pretty interesting because not every character's best aspect is the same at every player count. In fact, I would say the vast majority of them change, or at least have closer competition. We can take 4 as an example of this. I think his best aspect in solo play is actually his worst aspect in 4 player. So stay tuned for that. That'll be coming up. If you're interested, please subscribe. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. Let me know what aspect combinations you enjoy, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.